This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Justin Gest, and we talk demographics. We talk immigration. We talk the pros. We talk the cons. We talk about the controversy. It doesn't make a difference what country you are in. Immigration is sacrosanct. Immigration is the issue. Is there too little? Is there too much? Is one group favored over another? How does the politics break down? Nobody wants to have an honest conversation about immigration, especially in my country, America. Justin does a really good job of looking at various countries around the world and how they have dealt with demographic changes, how they've dealt with a need to change immigration. Or perhaps some might argue that was a mistake. Some people might call aspects of immigration a prejudice or racist. Others might say, hold on, we just can't let everyone into a country. Imagine, for example, if 50 million people wanted to immigrate to Switzerland tomorrow, to Singapore tomorrow. There are constraints. There are real world constraints to immigration. There are also real world debates. Today, you get one of those. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation today with Justin Gest and talk a little bit about his topic, demographics, and specifically his new book, Majority Minority. I hope you enjoy this episode with Justin Gest. I usually don't do talking points. Talking points came across my desk about you, your work, and I don't necessarily know that you even wrote them up, but I thought this one talking point would be such a great place to start. And here it is. Could marrying a Republican heal America? That just struck me. I was like, well, what in blazes is going on there? Let's unpack that a little. Before we even get into the nitty gritty of your work and all the fine details, let's unpack some of the big picture controversial type issues and get them on the table. And then we can kind of work backwards and start to fill in some of the data perhaps.
Let's just talk first about the context of this question of whether Democrats marrying Republicans could actually heal the United States and our social divides. The first thing is that new data from Ipsos Public Affairs shows that our political divisions are actually as strong, if not in some cases stronger and more divisive than racial or religious divisions in the United States. Another way of thinking about it is politics has become America's new religion. That is quite stunning for a country that remains quite divided along racial and religious lines. That is one piece of context. The second piece of context is that new research from Harvard University and my colleague and friend Ryan Enos that was just published in Nature shows that the United States has become segregated along partisan lines in a way that is akin to the way it has historically been segregated on racial lines. Residentially, Republicans are gravitating towards Republicans and Democrats towards Democrats, leading, of course, to less and less interaction between them. And the third point to bear in mind, the third piece of context, is that America's politics are becoming racialized. And by that, I mean our party preferences are being determined or at least correlated with our racial or religious identities in a way that we have not seen in a very long time. Some of your listeners may be thinking, well, yeah, obviously. But actually, as recently as 2004, George W. Bush split the Latino vote. He won 44% of the Latino vote, which was a record high. As recently as 2000, a majority of Muslim Americans supported George W. Bush in that election. As recently as 1992, Asian Americans split on the side of Republicans, favored Republicans and George H.W. Bush. It is really a relatively recent phenomenon that minorities in the United States overwhelmingly favor the Democrats, and that the Republican Party is so overwhelmingly white, given the racial demographics of the country. So when you take those three pieces of context in mind, what we find is that Democrats and Republicans are simply not seeing each other. They don't find it very much in common with each other. Those differences are driving partisan identity in a way that we have not seen before in American history, at least not modern American history. Democrats don't have to marry Republicans, of course, to fix this. That's a bit of an extreme and attention-seeking way of thinking about it. But certainly building a relationship with partisan counterparts, listening, beginning to empathize, hearing the stories of your partisan opponents or people who disagree with you is definitely the only path, I think, to healing the country.
Great take. I'll add a little grist to it all. This divide. I'm a white male, and I'm a keen observer. There's no doubt that a good portion of this divide is not only partisan, as you frame partisanship, but it's men and women. Men and women have dramatically different views. Taking a peek at the bell curve, obviously there's going to be outliers, but men and women in America right now have dramatically different views. I think I saw one piece of data where if Biden was receiving only electoral college votes from women, he would have been something like 400, and Trump, it would have been the opposite. So basically men were voting for Trump and women were voting for Biden. That's a huge part of this, isn't it?
Generally speaking, identity factors, identity attributes are becoming quite predictive of political preferences. Parties have latched onto this because it mobilizes people to the poll.
To be clear, though, when you say identity, you mean men and women, primarily.
No, men, women, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Protestants and evangelicals, Catholics, Muslims, Jews, all of these identity attributes are correlated to some extent or another with partisan preferences. You can also look at education and the shift of highly educated people more broadly to the Democratic Party. That is also new. There are a number of demographic attributes that go beyond just gender. And that is why politics feels so existential, I think, because tribes are contingent on co-identity. When the other side takes power, you fear that you will be left behind. And that is precisely how many white working class people feel about Democrats right now. And that is how a lot of urban liberals and members of ethnic and religious minorities feel about Republicans.
I'll add a perspective. Some people obviously thought he was controversial. Some people did not think he was so controversial. And that would have been President Trump. But during that time, I mean, it was nonstop for 4 years. I felt the fear. I felt the fear from the American left of like, oh my gosh, the gulags are coming. The end is near. 4 years later, it didn't happen. Now, we're in this situation where I'm watching major events around the world, especially in Western democracies, and I'm watching openly freedoms being challenged. The very freedoms that I thought the Democratic left was worried about under Trump, now with a Democratic president in America, some of this, we're going to mandate this, or if you say the wrong thing, you could be canceled, or your bank account could be canceled. All these kinds of things, which are not conspiracy theories. They're not hyperbole. I mean, it's happening, which is unusual to me.
Yeah.
That's a legitimate perspective?
I think it's a legitimate perspective. I think there's multiple legitimate perspectives here. So I don't see myself as representative of the American left or right or one party or the other. But I speak to enough people from both parties and both ideological perspectives to know that both sides feel threatened by the other. They do find the other side's politics existentially threatening. And yes, from the right, they feel like they have certain fundamental freedoms and liberties that are under threat. And they do fear that this prescriptive nature of political correctness and free speech is under some kind of assault.
Don't you think it is? I was just censored on Facebook for the first time in my life for linking to a CDC article. No commentary from me. I simply linked to a CDC article and I was censored. Now, somebody might say, hey, that's a private company. They can do what they want. Well, that's not exactly what's going on. We are facing a free speech issue in America for the first time ever, aren't we?
This is a little outside of my range of expertise. I think without question, people are having to be more careful about what they say in a way that I don't think we've witnessed before in American history. It is upsetting the hell out of a lot of people.
It's driving a lot of the partisanship. That's why I'm bringing it up. It's driving the divide.
No doubt. And on the other side, talk to folks on the American left, they will say, to your point about how 4 years of Donald Trump went by, there wasn't this crisis of democracy and shift to authoritarianism. And they will say, we almost had that crisis of democracy.
That's a problem right there. That's a problem because that answer causes the other side to just say, okay, we're digging our heels in.
I think that the real way to address these things is to actually, first off, listen to the other side, understand why people feel the way that they feel, and to recognize and to acknowledge that those are legitimate feelings. I think one of the worst parts of the politics of cancellation right now is that it has an invalidating quality to it. It makes one side, in this case, usually the American right, feel unwelcome and disqualified from the debate. And I think that that's unhealthy because what's going to happen is that they're just going to retreat to spaces where they do feel welcome, but aren't actually reaching people with differences of opinions. And that's not healthy for a democracy. People are just retreating to thicker and thicker silos. This goes back to why Democrats and Republicans actually have to hang out with each other a bit more.
You're optimistic.
I am optimistic because I actually don't even think we've tried very hard. You're a married couple and you've gone through the marriage therapy and you've done some group therapy and you've done some seances and meditation and nothing seems to work. I don't think we've even tried. I don't think there has been a distinct effort to unify this nation and to come to grips with the demographic change that is taking place before us. The United States is trying to do something that very few countries have done before, and that is sustain its sense of identity and nationhood and sustain its sense of solidarity and democracy despite dramatic demographic change. And no one has actually devoted their lives or their careers to actually bridging this gap. Imagine how much better we might be if we did.
Let me keep it at that for a moment, a good starting point. Demographic change. For many Americans, they will look around the world and they'll say, my gosh, these countries around the world have defendable borders. They have immigration policy. They let a certain number of people in. There's requirements, etc. And look, I told you I'm in Saigon. So guess what? If you're Vietnamese and you want to come to America, you go to the consulate or you go to the embassy, you apply. Almost everybody is turned down. What do you think I tell the Vietnamese how to get into America? I tell them to go to Mexico and run across the border. That's where I'm leading to, is that ultimately, this is where it gets right into the deep woods on the controversy. Why, when I look around the world, do I see borders? Whether it's China, Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, I mentioned some islands there, but European countries. And then America, we have this big, long, drawn-out fight about the idea that we should have a border, especially on the southern border. What has happened there in the last decade to cause that feeling where, to me, I think objectively I can say this, the left doesn't seem to care if there is an open border, and the right does seem to care if there's an open southern border?
I would characterize it a little bit differently. I think that about 90% of America does not like the idea of an open border, maybe even 95% of America.
Can we establish that we do have an open border? Millions of people have run across that border and they're in the country not going through the typical immigration process that the Vietnamese that I mentioned would have to go through.
That's actually an exaggeration. So yes, there's been millions of people over the last 30, 35 years, 40 years really. So yes, there have been millions over that time period. But actually, the number of people who are entering without authorization is actually at really relative lows, again, relative to what it looked like, say, in the late 1990s and 2000s. What we're actually seeing more of today is people coming across the border, not in a sort of clandestine fashion where they're trying to sneak across the border, but where they're coming across the border and then claiming asylum, often dubiously, but claiming asylum and then putting the onus on our authorities to make a decision about whether that claim is recognized. and in some cases being released into the United States while their cases are being adjudicated, where you have unaccompanied children being sent over. They become the responsibility of the US government and the various charities that look after them until they're placed with family members or friends.
I mean, this was the big issue, perhaps the issue as to why Trump was elected. And he used a very marketing, simple phrase that people understood: build a wall.
Yeah, symbolic.
I was just reading today about how Dominican Republic is building a wall between Haiti. And there's all kinds of walls around this world. Some of these island nations are, I guess, lucky that's their wall. But why is it that I know you're making the case that demographics are changing, but a lot of Americans are saying, well, yeah, I know demographics are changing, but why can't we control the change, at least on a legal sense, when it comes to immigration? Why do we have this unfettered crossing the border?
The demographics of the United States are changing in a way that is uncontrollable, but it's not uncontrollable because we don't have control over the border. We have reasonable amount of control of the border. It's not like Australia, but Australia is one big island. We're not like Singapore, but Singapore is also a big island, or a small island in that case. It's uncontrollable because our demographic change is actually predominantly driven by fertility rates. We can't control how many babies white people do not have, and we can't control how many babies non-white people do have. It is that differential that is really driving things. White people in the United States are aging. They're having fewer children. Most of our demographic growth is coming in the form of immigrants and the children that they have in this country. That's what makes it so uncontrollable. At the same time, in the same spirit, if immigrants and people of immigrant origin were not having so many children, the United States would likely start to depopulate quite soon, and our economy would shrink, our global competitiveness would shrink. And so really, from the most nationalistic America first view, the best thing that could happen is for immigrants to come in, have children, and actually sustain the economy. So it really is in the eye of the beholder how you view this demographic change.
Well, you make a good point there in the sense that, okay, and someone asked me this for a book years ago. They asked, I think it was after the Great Recession, they asked how I would solve things. And the answer that I gave was something along the lines of increased immigration. And I'm not an expert as you are, but I gave the answer of an increased immigration, but kind of with a fitness test when it came to wealth or ability, meaning it wasn't just anybody and everybody. If we're going to open the borders to whoever to come to America, then we should discriminate in the sense that if somebody shows up with a doctorate from India, that's much different than someone showing up with nothing, claiming asylum, looking to go straight to welfare. These are controversial topics and people get all worked up if you bring it up, but this is the truth of the matter. And so I guess what frustrates me when it comes to immigration, because I think your point is well stated, we don't seem to be, and I bring up Vietnam again, we don't seem to be after, to go back to David Halberstam's book, The Best and the Brightest, we seem to just be an open immigration as to filtering our immigration. And we're not doing immigration that's across the world. We're really doing it across our southern border, which is primarily Mexico, Central America, and South America. Why can't we have an immigration policy that perhaps allows the entire world to have the chance to immigrate to America versus a particular set of countries and a particular group of people?
Your point here is that we're just not being discretionary enough, yeah?
There's a ton of people around this world that have pursued education, they've pursued building businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And those people are, frankly, unless they're living along our southern border, are not allowed to immigrate to America. But our immigration policy right now seems to be just get across. That is attracting people that are taking more risks and perhaps have less to lose. I just don't see why we don't have a comprehensive approach. Now, of course, the State Department will say we do, but I've got enough friends in Vietnam. I know how the process works. And to get into America, unless you're along that southern border, is nearly impossible today.
That is fair. America's immigration system is a complete anachronism. It is totally obsolete. It is stuck back in 1965, which is when it was last truly reformed, comprehensively reformed. It was updated in 1986 with a bill called IRCA, IRCA, but it has been largely unchanged since. Just like any outdated piece of equipment or policy, it's not going to be fit for purpose for very long after that. It's been over 35 years now. Many countries not just Singapore or Vietnam, have outpaced America in the sort of competitiveness of their admission systems. But we're talking about two different things here. One is enforcement at the borders, and two is admissions and selection. Who do we let in? We need to, no doubt, shore up how we are governing the border to both facilitate greater migration so that people who actually have a lot to give to the country and are needed in the country can enter, but also to select people in a much more sophisticated way than we have. And there are lots of different ways to do this.
We're not doing those. I've been living outside the state since 2013 and nothing's changed. Nothing's changed.
At this point, any change might be helpful. But just to be clear, the Republican Party under Donald Trump used to hold the views that you have, used to say, we need the best and the brightest. We need to recruit people who are going to innovate, who are going to fill critical skills gaps in our economy. But that is no longer the Republican Party of Donald Trump. The Republican Party of Donald Trump right now is a party that will not approve new immigration legislation unless it actually curtails the number of immigrants, unless it cuts immigrants. So sure, there are Republicans now that would support greater stringent criteria and more discretion as to who is admitted, but only if we are also simultaneously cutting the number of people we're admitting. And that would be disastrous for the American economy and disastrous for American demographics and global competitiveness more generally. And so unfortunately, we are at this stalemate because we have Democrats who you've characterized, I think, a little bit more left-leaning than they really are, but then Republicans who are more right-leaning than I think we're characterizing them here. Gridlock is inevitable.
Just to be fair in terms of that perspective, I did a little quick search on your most recent book here, and I just searched for the terms far left, radical left. It doesn't appear that you think that the left can get radical or the left can be far left.
What do you mean that the left can be far left?
Well, I mean, there can be a far right, there can be a radical right, but can there be a radical left and a far left?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, actually, it was the subject of some recent research that I just did in Europe, where we focused on a lot of far left parties to better understand what drives people to support them. Europe, you actually have a full spectrum of parties that span from the far left to the far right. And so I was very interested in studying it quite closely. To the extent that there is a far left in the United States, I would actually characterize anyone who believes in open borders as pretty far left. I think that that's nowhere near where the weight of the Democratic Party is right now. In fact, in the 2020 campaign, Democratic presidential candidates who were vying for the nomination were falling over themselves and each other, trying to convey to the American public that they do not support defunding immigration enforcement officers or abolishing ICE, as it was called, and do not support open borders. I don't think there was a single candidate who supported it. So I do think that's a pretty fringe view in the United States. It is there in certain circles who view it from a very humanitarian perspective.
To get into this topic, when you start to look at demographics and what's going on in the states politically right now, racial issues come up and racial politics come up. I know that you have a perspective that you would like to see us move beyond that. I can give some kind of typical American view. I will give the view as being outside the states for an extended period of time, which is I start to really wonder when I look at successful countries around the world and I look at their demographics, they're often of one tribe. They're often of one group. They're often seem like a bunch of brothers and sisters, so to speak. America is the melting pot, the place where we say that diversity is our strength. If diversity is America's strength, and that's the thing we should all shoot for, well, then when I observe countries around the world, and I know we might actually talk about Singapore here in a little while, which is an interesting story. But when I observe countries around the world, sometimes that homogeneity has a lot of power, a lot of success, a lot of usefulness to it compared to the strife in a multi-racial political makeup.
From the outside, we tend to perceive other places as far more homogenous than they actually are. Many places that convey a sense of homogeneity are often far more diverse, whether it's on sectarian lines or ethnic lines or normative lines, what have you. But I think it is indubitable that the United States is a remarkably diverse country relative to other very successful and highly industrialized democracies around the world.
Or non-democracies.
Or non-democracies, yes. We are just a diverse country. And as I know you know, in this book, Majority Minority, I study a lot of countries that simulate the reality that we have here, that actually are as diverse as we are, in some cases more diverse. But I know we'll come to that later. We should ask ourselves, what does homogeneity convey? What does that do for a country? What work does it do for a country? And I think that the answer is that it lends itself to a sense of solidarity. It lends itself to a sense of nationhood that is more coherent and cohesive because people believe that they are more naturally, normatively aligned with each other. They come from the same place. They're all sons of the proverbial soil. That means that they all have a sense that they belong. In many ways, our politics today in the United States are made so much more divisive because many people do not feel like they belong in the other party's country. Many white working class Republicans, and Republicans more broadly, are scared that they're going to be left behind and excluded and discriminated against in a Democrat's America. Democrats believe that there's going to be some kind of nostalgic reversal back to Jim Crow if Republicans were to take over.
Hold on. When you say Democrats, though, it might be scared of a reversal to Jim Crow. What you're really saying is Black America, because Black America votes basically 95 to 99% Democrat.
No, I mean all Democrats. I mean all Democrats.
Right. But you brought up the issue of, let's say, okay, you've got the white working class. Their voting bloc is nowhere near close to, because there's a lot of white working class that still hold on to these, I vote Democrat. That's what my family's always done. But when it comes to the Black vote in America, that is, if the Black vote was not basically 90 to 100%, the Democratic Party would never win another election in America.
It's a very reliable voting bloc for the Democrats for obviously almost half a century now. It's about 90% Democratic, yes.
Is that so high of a percentage? Is that fear?
That's part and parcel of the racialization of American politics, going back to how we started off our chat today.
Let me just push you for a little bit. So, I've had Walter Williams, who passed along a year or two so back, George Mason economist, Black American. What was interesting about Walter Williams is he had this libertarian perspective, for lack of a better term, but he wasn't defined by his skin. He had a perspective that he wanted to believe in. And that's what I find interesting about, for example, the Black voting bloc, is it seems to be racialized. It seems to be, this is where we are. It's not even you can't win us over with this perspective. You can't win us over with that perspective. We vote this way no matter what.
From most African Americans' perspectives, I'm not sure that Republicans have actually made a compelling attempt to bring their votes over. At this point, a lot of Republican politics has been thinly veiled racial resentment. And in more recent years, I'm not sure how thinly veiled it's been. I'm not sure that Republicans have made a concerted effort to actually recruit Black votes to their party.
Can I push more there? How would they do that? I mean, let's say, for example, a large part of the Black population in America is in inner city America, which is controlled by Democratic councils, Democratic legislatures. I'm not sure how that inroads is supposed to happen. I mean, this is getting to the point, I think, of your overall work, which is people are separated for all kinds of reasons. And you and I could sit here for probably hours and get into the nitty gritty of why we're separated. But we are separated, aren't we?
Yeah, we're separated residentially and physically. We're separated socially in terms of who we hang out with. New data from Ipsos Public Affairs shows that Americans of different races, about 50% of the United States, has not shared a meal with someone of a different racial background in the last year. We're not really even talking to each other. We're not breaking bread with each other. Yes, this is absolutely at the heart of our politics. If you're more interested in Black Republicans and African-American politics, we have a wonderful scholar at George Mason named Michael Fauntleroy, who has studied this much more closely than I have. Yeah, fundamentally, we are not in touch. And that is incredibly detrimental to democracy. And going back to your points about being homogenous, when we don't feel like we belong in the other party's country, it is harder and harder to put country above party. It is harder to put country above race or ethnic group or religious group. That's what we're seeing in the United States. People are putting political party in many cases or racial or ethnic affinities above country.
These divisions are deep. They can be argued from both sides. I try my level-headed best to see it from both sides. Obviously, I think anyone that listens to me is going to realize I'm a little bit skewed to one side, but I wanted to find myself as right, so to speak. I think the system is broken, and I think I look at things on more on a basic principles perspective, which is, for me, for a society to operate and to move forward, there can't be rampant crime. We have to have that controlled. And I think one of the points that you make, we need to have fertility. We need to have children. That needs to happen. And I think also then people, especially on the right, would make this argument. If you're going to have children, perhaps mankind has learned over the centuries that a kind of more traditional perspective has worked. Typical nuclear family has worked well. Now, the left might say, well, hold on. Typical nuclear family has left a lot of us out. We're not exactly like you. We don't operate that same way. But this is where the rubber is meeting the road, these different perspectives meeting head on.
Yeah, I'm not sure you need a quote unquote typical nuclear family to facilitate fertility. Certainly a lot of people on the left in the United States in particular would point to penalties that parents experience with the high cost of childcare and schooling, with the challenges of a work-life balance in the United States.
But those issues are all kind of like American namby-pamby issues. People around the world just pull their boots up and go, they work.
Well, and it's not helping Europe any either. You have very good social systems in much of Northern Europe. Their fertility rates are actually quite low.
When we started talking, you're an in-shape guy, you're a thin guy. I think one of the issues that comes up also, how do we get people thinking? How do we get people interacting together? And then it becomes really tough if people have unwound the spring a little bit. And this is both parties. They've unwound the spring a little bit and have let themselves go physically. That's not necessarily great for democracy either.
I've never thought of the effects of obesity on democracy, but I will say that one of the ways that you do bring people together to actually have discussions, to bond with one another, it's not politics. A good way of getting Democrats to hang out with Republicans is not to say, hey, let's debate healthcare tonight. Want to meet me at the bar? No one wants to do that. On the other hand, Democrats are happy to meet Republicans and Republicans are happy to meet Democrats if you're meeting them to enjoy a sports game, or to go play some sports, or to go to a music hall or concert, or to talk about literature or cuisine or dine. It is these cultural components that America is incredibly blessed with, just incredible cultural riches that do bring people together and that can be leveraged to create greater sense of cohesion. Even though there are cultural differences between Democrats and Republicans, certainly in the sort of brands that they like and the certain sports that they follow and play, but there's enough overlap. Everyone watches baseball. Everyone watches American football. These are ways to actually build bridges.
As a former baseball player, you might actually be wrong about that. The demographics in baseball have changed dramatically from when I was a kid. There used to be all kinds of Black All-Stars, American homegrown Black All-Stars. Now there's a ton of Dominican baseball All-Stars now, but the Black interest in baseball has changed.
I was more referring to Democrat-Republican splits.
Okay.
Baseball still brings together, I think, both parties, as does the NFL. Racially, demographics, yes, that matters. And it matters for hockey as well, for that matter.
Yeah. Hey, let me bring up something I don't know how this necessarily fits in, but as I think about your world, I think about what you're trying to bring forward. And it's just, you're a guy that's digging into the demographics, but obviously the demographics get quite political in America. I think one of the interesting things, and I would love to hear your perspective about this, I think this is a significant divide between groups in America. Let's just say the left and the right. I grew up in Vienna, Virginia, okay? 6 of the top 10 wealthiest counties in America surround DC, and they vote one color, and it ain't red. And I think this is something that America is going to have to address as well to get people to meet on both sides, because if the administrative state is manned by one party, this is going to create resentment. This is going to create conflict. And I give my Democratic friends credit. They've figured it out. Come live in the DC area, get 2-income cushy job, and no one's ever going to fire you. You're going to make a boatload of money. There's not an economic reason in the world that a house in Vienna, Virginia should sell for $2 million, but it sure as hell does. It's going to be interesting to see if this particular issue of how government is manned gets resolved as well, too, because I think from the right's perspective, I don't think they see an equitable manning of the system.
Yeah, but what you have there, Michael, is selection bias. To work for the government, you usually have to believe in the government. For so long, Republicans have really condemned government as actually a part of the problem. It's not surprising that you would have that selection effects as to who's actually working for the government. To defend those DC suburbs, I happen to live in more of the urban.
Oh, I know, I'm picking on you.
But, in their defense, the folks in those really rich counties, they don't work for the government. They're probably contractors. They're maybe physicians who work related to the government, their clientele or something.
It's all connected. It's all connected.
The government is the industry, right? If Hollywood's an industry for LA and finance and Wall Street's the industry for New York, government is certainly the industry for DC. These bureaucrats aren't getting rich off their jobs. Those rich counties are the same types of folks who get rich elsewhere. To be fair to them as well, a lot of those counties have been purple. I think of people like Barbara Comstock, who is the former representative for a Northern Virginia district in the House of Representatives. I think of former Representative Tom Davis, who is the rector of George Mason University, but also a member of the House for Northern Virginia. And he represented Vienna.
Every Republican that I know would consider Tom a Democrat today. He was so middle of the road and so not taking chances. Tom would be the last person that should be ascribed as a leader of the quote right. They would not like him.
And that's just my point. A lot of these suburbs were Republican. I think a lot of them would say that the Republican Party left them. They didn't leave the Republican Party. And I think that's what's happened. That's why people like Congressman Davis and Congresswoman Comstock are no longer in Congress.
Well, Northern Virginia was changed by the dot-com bubble and the whole internet space. Basically, early 90s, Fairfax County was still voting 60% Republican. That's flipped to probably 70 or 80% Democrat now. So it's been a big change in the last 20 years. Probably, I would say for the state of Virginia, for you, for a demographics guy, there could be no more interesting dive in than the state of Virginia. I mean, there's probably been no more greater amount of political change in the state of Virginia than almost anywhere. I mean, it's pretty crazy.
I think there's a number of areas like this. States are arbitrary lines, but what we're really seeing is urbanization of the Democratic Party and the ruralization of the Republican Party, which of course is why we see the suburbs in the crosshairs of every election these days.
Let me shift you out of America because you and I could get bogged down there and stuff, because I want to shift to a place that's close to me, and maybe we could have a little bit of debate about who spent more time there. I'm not sure how much time you spent there. You've spent significant time there. That'd be Singapore. And, I have a lot of friends, associates, clients out of Singapore, and I haven't been for a couple of years because of COVID, but I've spent a lot of time there. I've always liked Singapore. On the surface, there's not much not to like, but I do have friends that struggle and they'll talk about how hard things are. But then again, when you look at the history of Singapore and you look to where it's risen to, and you do a good job of this in your book, you lay out the criticisms, and you can surely address some in a moment when you talk. It's an interesting place. I think the thing that I love about a place like Singapore is compared to a big city in America, Singapore's clean. Singapore doesn't have violence. Now, those might sound trite to somebody who lives in Los Angeles or San Diego or whatnot, because they might just say, well, whatever, we're used to it. When you're in some of these Asian cities that don't have the violence, that are clean, or regardless of how they got there, and you do a great case of making the case on how Singapore got there, regardless of how they got there, it's still impressive.
Singapore is phenomenal. Singapore is something to behold. It's a beautiful place. It is an incredibly well-run, impeccably well-run place, exquisitely designed place. But it is also socially a hall of mirrors. It is an absolute autocracy that is concerned with giving the feeling of freedom without actually necessarily providing the liberties associated with that freedom.
Kind of sounds like America these days.
I'll let you elaborate on that social commentary. But when it comes to Singapore, it is just such a fascinating place filled with paradoxes. It is both, in some ways, a paragon, but in other ways, a dystopia.
I'm sure some Singaporean listeners would probably, maybe they might not say it in public. Maybe some of them are nodding their head. Maybe some of them are vociferously disagreeing with you. As an outsider coming to Singapore, I'm never going to feel those things that you just described. I know a little bit about the history. I know the breaking away from Malaysia, Got a lot of Malaysian friends and clients too as well. Malaysia is an interesting place as well. I mean, there's some interesting racial politics inside Malaysia. Why don't I let you go ahead and unpack some of what you were referring to in Singapore?
In my book, In Majority Minority, I wanted to study a number of societies that have already undergone this majority minority milestone that the United States is ostensibly approaching. Many people think the United States is going to be the first country to ever actually go through a majority minority shift, but actually this has happened in a number of other countries, and Singapore is one of them. Singapore was a part of the Malay Federation post-colonially after the British granted independence until 1965. And then one day in 1965, effectively overnight, the Malay Federation expelled the city-state, the island of Singapore, from its sovereign control and instantly turned what was a city that was a part of a broader Malay country into a Chinese dominant sovereign entity. Singapore had always had a very large Chinese immigrant origin population, some of whom were Peranakan Chinese from elsewhere in Southeast Asia, others who came from the mainland. As a result, when that 1965 shift took place, you had a city-state that was 73% Chinese, about 14% Malay, and 8% what they refer to as Indian, which are usually Tamils, but it's a mix of people. And then a smaller percentage of people who they refer to as other or Eurasian. Those demographics have been frozen in time since 1965 by the state, ostensibly to create what they call demographic balance. But actually, what it does is it freezes into place the Chinese predominance in this city that was once a part of Greater Malaysia. Instantly, you have this fascinating controversy over what demographics ought to be, what is the appropriate understanding of balance. And to maintain this Chinese predominance in Singapore, the state has gone through all kinds of funny contortions where you have every building in Singapore, every public housing, and 80% of Singaporeans live in public housing. Every public housing building is equally commensurate to that demographic distribution. So every building, every skyscraper in Singapore is 73% Chinese. The logic of racial divisions and boundaries is present everywhere, from where you get social services and certain healthcare services to what's on your identification card. You are labeled one race or another, and it's assigned to you by the government at birth. You have a state that has really oriented itself around this, and yet at the same time, and this is what makes it also paradoxical, claims to be race blind, claims to be supporting a single Singapore, a solidaristic Singapore, all at the same time. It's a little bit of cognitive dissonance in this just beautiful tropical utopia or dystopia, depending on what side you're on.
Okay, so let me give the defense for my Chinese friends and my Chinese ancestor friends. I think you make an interesting case. If I look across Asia, if I go to KL, if I go to Bangkok, if I go to Jakarta, Manila, Ho Chi Minh City, there is a significant Chinese influence. There is significant Chinese money. I can see why negative arguments could be made. But from the Chinese perspective, I could say, well, you know what? They are extremely organized. They are of a merchant class. They get shit done. They keep things organized. It's impressive. Well, even if I'm on the mainland in China, it's impressive what they can pull off. You and I both know more people have been pulled out of poverty since 1979 in mainland China than any other time in human history. It's absolutely amazing. So I wonder, as you describe Singapore as potentially the utopia or dystopia, perhaps it's just something where the leaders have to say, you know, it's going to take time, but we're going to instill the values that it's a power move, of course, but we're going to instill the values that we believe in, that we know have worked for millennia. Everyone else is going to have to eventually adopt these values and come along with us. I can see from their perspective, if we analyze it in the moment, okay, maybe everything's not perfect, but I do think there's a vision there that's defendable. Because again, we got to talk about the positives of Singapore. I don't have to walk around in Singapore like I would in downtown LA or DC and someone shooting me, knifing me, or peeing on me. I don't have that concern. What do you think about that defense?
I can reassure you that walking around Washington, D.C. or L.A., which is actually where I am right now, I don't have those fears. I haven't been shot, knifed, or peed on.
But on the flip side, though, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you can find the tent city with needles laying everywhere. And this doesn't exist in Singapore. So I want everyone to be clear. These are dramatically different cities.
I think more affirmatively, Singapore is a tightly controlled, well-run, highly functional, peaceful, and stable and prosperous city-state.
It probably sounds pretty good to a lot of people.
Absolutely. And the trade-off here is that it is an autocracy. The trade-off being asked of its citizens is go along with this dictatorship, and it is a benevolent dictatorship. At least that's the way they want to sell themselves.
Generally, all of Asia is in 2022.
And things are going to stay fine. The exchange of stability for control, for liberty, stability in exchange for liberty, is the bargain that all Singaporeans must make. I don't judge people for making that bargain. It's not a bargain that I want to make. It's not a bargain that I would make in the United States, but I don't judge them for making it. I try to write that chapter as open-minded, and I hope you agree, as open-minded of a manner as possible, calling Singapore out for its contradictions, where I think it is deceptive or where it's actually not being truthful, but also recognizing the remarkable success, the magnificent success that they have had. But that doesn't mean that we should be overlooking all those contradictions.
Yeah, and I think that gives us a good place to kind of wind down to maybe bring it back to North America in particular, which is this notion of liberty, this notion of autocracy. And I think this is another one of these divides that's driving a wedge in America right now, is that many Americans feel like the ACLU, they used to be all for minority rights, and now they seem to be on the side of the deep state, kind of telling me I can't bank here, or I can't speak, or something like that, or everything's a hate crime, or I'm a terrorist. I think this is the part that's interesting for Americans, is that America's founded differently than a place like Singapore, but it seems like it's moving in the same direction. In fact, I think a lot of people are deathly afraid, and I might be one of them, that every country is moving in the direction of an autocracy. Some people on the right look at some people on the left and say, how do you not see that? Why are you going along with this? Why do you think it's okay to seize people's bank accounts? Why do you think it's okay to censor people? And the polls are pretty clear that a lot of people on the American left right now think that's okay, which is strange. It's an interesting dovetail back from Singapore to America, because I think this is the fear. But I would argue, to take it even one step further, is like, you know what? This is where we're going. I do believe this. I believe that every nation's going this direction. So you just got to find the one where you can coexist the best.
I'm happy to talk more about the United States. I'm sorry for turning the spotlight back on you, Michael, but it is, I think, something that's worth unpacking why you're so disappointed in controls on free speech that take place in the United States, whether it's on Facebook or just from cancel culture. But you're willing to accept that bargain in Singapore, because that's precisely the bargain that Singaporeans make. You cannot criticize the state in any kind of meaningful way, whether it's on Facebook or really even publicly in the form of protest in Singapore. You are selling away those liberties and those rights that you are lamenting are under threat in the United States.
Every smart person I know is censoring themselves in the States right now. Every smart person knows they can no longer speak about the U.S. government the same way they could have 5 or 10 years ago. It has completely changed. That's completely changed. I'm not saying I like any of it anywhere. I'm just saying is like, this is the reality that we're all facing. Maybe at some stage of the game, the way that there might be this coming together for the different groups that you outline in your work, it might be that if a government goes too far, that brings people together.
Yeah, maybe, but on a more interpersonal level, because a lot of people who read majority minority are going to say, okay, Gest, so what am I going to do here? Is there some kind of action item here? I think that at the individual level, because the book says a lot about governments and what leaders should be doing and institutions should be doing, which is very high level, obviously. But at the individual level, we need to better understand our countrymen. We need to better understand where they come from. And we cannot censor them and invalidate them and disqualify them because they say something that is offensive or discomforting.
I'm happy to hear you say that so unequivocally because
otherwise people aren't going to talk to each other, Michael. And that's where we are right now. Where we are right now is that people are not talking to each other, whether because they find what other people are saying so discomforting, so offensive that their ears cannot be exposed to it, or because they don't actually have any exposure to what other people think.
I know you have a personal view on this, but why the censorship thing in America? Why has this happened? I mean, you know this. There is so much case law that establishes how we communicate inside of America. Mike, me, I can't go into the theater and start screaming fire for no reason. If I do something libelous, somebody can sue my rear end. How did we get past that to where it's now we're saying, well, something's misinformation? And it seems like the masses just go along with this. So hold on. Misinformation can mean anything. It's subjective. How did we get to this point, Justin? It's crazy.
First off, there are going to be a lot of answers to this question, and they're going to be coming from sociologists who are better qualified to answer this question than your guest today. One component that I think is undeniable is simply that we are less exposed to disagreeable opinions today than we ever have been at perhaps any time in our history. People do not have debates, real debates. People are not exposed to media forms that express views that are different from their own, or at least not significantly different from their own. And they live in places that are segregated by these ideological differences too. When you're not accustomed to it, you're not going to like it very much. I'm an Angelino by birth, and I still don't like snow. And one of the reasons why probably is because I grew up without any kind of seasons in my entire life in Los Angeles. When you're not accustomed to something, you're probably not going to be as adaptable. We are raising generations of young people now in the United States who are growing up without any exposure to the other side and find them repulsive.
The natural reach when people are finding the other side repulsive. If you've got a good example, I'm willing to hear it. But this censorship thing does not feel like a right perspective. The censorship, and you can't say certain things, whether I'm looking at Canada, Australia, New Zealand, America, this is coming from the left. I don't get it.
I recently gave a guest lecture at another university. During the question and answer session, a student told me that what I was saying made her uncomfortable. Not because I said anything that was like profane or obscene, but because it was disagreeable. I said, I'm really sorry. It was not my intention to discomfort you, but what I'm telling you is based on empirical research. You're just going to have to be discomforted effectively. Like there's nothing much I can do about that. I'm not going to apologize for saying what I said, although I'm disappointed that it discomforted this person.
You're nicer than me.
I was raised by a Southern woman.
I was too, but
anything you want to say can be said diplomatically, but that doesn't mean I'm always so restrained.
I give you props. You are quite the diplomat.
I'm not diplomatic just for the sake of being diplomatic.
Let me let you go with the girl story. I didn't mean to interrupt.
I think that this is problematic. I think that worrying about discomfort from hearing disagreeable views is unsustainable. That said, there is a line that we have to draw, I think, on misinformation. And I realize just how subjective that can be. But I also will point to the fact that we do still have objective sources out there. We do still have sources that are accountable to ombudsmen and the institutional checks that are out there. There are ways of corroborating information from more than one source.
50% of my audience thinks that's not true.
They have a right to that view. But I think that we do have to be careful at calling out when something is objectively false. Now, if people still want to believe it, that's their right. They should have every right to do that. The companies who are concerned with doing it, and again, we are outside of my range and my territory, but these are private entities who are concerned with moderating their sites. And there's a Texas lawsuit right now over just this matter, where the plaintiffs here are Facebook, Google, via YouTube, and Twitter that people can look up. But I think that that is holistically different from hearing something that you find disagreeable.
The term misinformation, I think generally when people on the right hear that phrase, they realize instinctively, okay, this is a maneuver. This is propaganda. This is BS. People on the left immediately think, oh my gosh, I can't believe misinformation is being spread. The problem is, though, is if we don't actually get into the nitty gritty, then it's just left up in the clouds. So, for example, if you say, well, some misinformation is bad, well, again, 50% of my audience is going to say, well, what are you talking about? If we don't get into the details, then we're up here fighting in the clouds about, well, you said misinformation. I didn't say any misinformation. And we're like, well, hold on. What are we even talking about?
Let me leave you with an anecdote from my field work from a previous book that I wrote. It's called The New Minority, and it's all about white working class Americans and British people in the years before leading up to Trump's election and Brexit. When I was out in the field, I noticed that literally dozens, more than 24 of my respondents would preface statements to me by telling me, now I'm not a racist, but, and of course they would then say something. And sometimes what they said was really prejudiced, but other times it was absolutely nothing to do with race at all. And I began to ask myself, Michael, why is this happening? Are people going through some kind of sensitivity training or something? And obviously that wasn't what was going on. What I was realizing was that the very idea of what racism is had changed. For so many, and certainly at its inception, racism was this social concept that alerted us to implicit biases and prejudices and double standards that we hold in our heads. But what racism had become for many white working class folks, the folks that I was interviewing in those days, was that it was viewed as a muzzle, as a mute button, as a way of disqualifying what they had to say. Because the word racism had been used in so many ways to silence others, that it ceased to actually have that incredibly profound meaning that it was endowed with in the first place. I do think we have to be careful with what we label misinformation and what we think is just disagreeable, in the same way that we can't just disqualify someone for saying something that is clumsy, but not necessarily prejudiced, that is maybe resentful, but not necessarily espousing white supremacy. These words take on new meanings, and in some cases, they lose meaning from overuse. And I think that's really what you're lamenting here.
Yeah, I would think probably in the last 5 or 6 years, if I was an outsider to America, I would assume that probably, 95% of all white people are in the Klan, 100% are white nationalists. And I think that has been a huge issue, which is the propaganda. And let's face it, everybody's doing this for a reason. For me, just to kind of add to what you just said, arguments about racism have ceased to become really about racism anymore. Arguments about racism are now just a way to get power and money. This is what's happened.
I think that's taking it too far. I mean, I think that racism remains, a problem in American society. And many of our conversations about racism, I think, are legitimate. But I also think that there are times when it's been overused or extended to a point that actually doesn't give it the meaning that it deserves.
The interesting thing about that perspective, though, is that, as you mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, most different groups are not even associating with each other. The ways that racism is occurring in America are not ways that the typical person is necessarily seeing, because they're not even interacting with each other.
Right. I was exposed to a lot of racism in the form of racist remarks when I was doing my field work. I made a strategic choice not to call out my respondents when they said things that I thought were offensive or prejudiced, because I wasn't there to be teaching anyone lessons in social grace or otherwise, or diversity and inclusion. I was there to listen. I think that if we are really committed to building bridges across this country, then it's going to take tolerance for hearing things that you find disagreeable and maybe even discomforting. That is going to be a fundamental challenge to dialogue and discourse. I don't know if this is going to be reassuring or not, but one of the other cases that I study very closely is Trinidad and Tobago. Racist is a term that is bandied around and thrown about by both sides. The Afro-Caribbeans, who make up about 40% of Trinidad and Tobago, and the Indo-Indian origin Caribbeans, who make up another 40% of Trinidad and Tobago, call each other racists all the time. Politically, socially, it is all over the place. The use of racism so frequently in Trinidad and Tobago by both sides in equal manners almost creates this awkward detente inside of their politics over the politics of race, which really does drive so much of their politics in a democracy, by the way. Maybe that's enough just to whet people's appetite to actually read a little bit more about Trinidad and Tobago.
The funny thing, too, is that you've got this optimism. You've got this hope for a change. But you and I both know the trend line is not good. There's really nothing on the horizon that's going to upset that trend line. And it does feel like, I talk to a lot of people, it does feel like that we keep accelerating to something that's not good, but it feels like we're accelerating to something. So I give you credit for being hopeful and optimistic. I'm not sure the trend line agrees with you, though.
The trend line sucks. I'm not going to sugarcoat that reality. I'm not here as a motivational speaker. I'm here as an empirical researcher. The trend line's not good. And frankly, even looking at these 6 other societies that have undergone majority-minority shifts doesn't really endow any of my readers with lots of optimism.
You do a great job of diving in, though, and getting people to think. You got me to think, whether they agree with you, disagree with you, whether they reach out, not reach out, at least you're putting more on the table. Putting more on the table quite differently than somebody flipping on cable news at night for an hour, which is just segregated sides.
That's a low bar. It's like telling me that it's the cleanest restroom on the Jersey Turnpike or something, but I'll take the compliment. I do hope that the book makes people think, and I hope that it illuminates some solutions, or at least the pathway towards some solutions that we haven't really pursued very much at all.
The book, Majority, Minority. Justin, where can we send people? Where would you like them to go? They can book Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff. Is there a website you would like people to go to?
Well, you can check out my personal website, which is Justin Gest, which is spelled GEST.com. So justingest.com. You can see more information about the book. If you're interested in purchasing the book, all your major retailers will have it, or you can go directly to Oxford University Press's website, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. I write pretty frequently for the mainstream press, and so if you're ever interested in some of those articles, you can just Google me too.
Cool. Thank you, sir.
With pleasure. Thanks for the invitation, Michael.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.